welcome to this edition of Vantage Point here on Newsfirst MTV. I am Shahin Jurampati, your host this evening. Well, we've had a rather interesting or eventful past 2 weeks. We had the passing of Most Venerable Madilu Avisobitotera, a controversial resignation of Tilak Marapan as the Minister of Law and Order and Prisons Reform. Surrounding the avant-garde issue, we've had a devastating and disastrous attack in Paris where 132 people were killed, and the controversial detention of a group of political prisoners under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Well, to discuss all these matters, we have Dr. Dayan Jatilaka, former diplomat and political analyst. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Good evening, Shahin.
Doctor, like I said before, we've had the passing of Most Venerable Madilu Avisobitotera. What is your comments on the Most Venerable Tero?
Well, I think his life was a mirror of Sri Lanka's contemporary political history. When I was first acquainted with the Reverend Sobita, he was actually a militant Sinhala Buddhist nationalist preacher. This was in the 1980s during the administration of President Jayawardene, and he was one of the most militant ideological opponents of devolution at that time, and certainly the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. But he evolved over time, and over the last few years, he was the most prominent figure in the civil society initiative for regime change from below. The main project was the abolition of the executive presidency and a single issue candidacy, that is a common presidential candidate who would be committed to this single issue of the abolition of the executive presidency. That proved pretty much effective, and in that sense, that was the last, perhaps the last chapter of Venerable Sobita's intervention in political life.
Many say that rather than a political leader, he was more of a person who created religious harmony among many religions. What is your take on that?
Well, that depends on which period you're talking about. In the last phase, his main effort was more political. It concerned the abolition of the executive presidency. And he was campaigning on that platform for a couple of years. He also put forward the idea of a common candidate. That is, a candidate different from the candidacy of the main opposition party, the UNP. If not for Venerable Sobita's intervention, the present Prime Minister, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, would have been the UNP candidate and would have been the opposition's main candidate at the presidential election, which is what the government of that time was ready for. And the outcome might have been quite different. But the space was created for Mr. Maithripala Sirisena to come over and be an effective candidate because Venerable Sobita, among others, but Venerable Sobita most prominently, had created a platform for opposition unity. So that was not so much a religious intervention, but a political intervention, and I might say a social intervention as a civil society leader. As far as religious harmony goes, yes, in the last several years, many years, he was for religious harmony, and he played a major role. But there's also the famous book that appeared in the late 80s by Harvard University professor Stanley J. Thambaya, Sri Lankan born, who himself was a Buddhist. And he was Professor Emeritus at Harvard University. He authored a book called Buddhism Betrayed, with a question mark. And the book was about the role of militant Sinhala Buddhism as an obstacle to ethnic reconciliation. And the cover of that book had a photograph of Venerable Sobita delivering a very militant speech. Now, there's a reason that Professor Tambaya put that photograph, because at that time of our contemporary history, Venerable Sobhita was in fact preaching a kind of a militant Sinhala Buddhism, which he moved away from and mellowed. But at that time, that was his role. It wasn't exactly a role for ethno-religious harmony at that time. And therefore, Professor Stanley Tambaya and his publishers chose that photograph, a photograph of Venerable Sobhita, to illustrate this book. Stanley Tambaya's speciality was, of course, Buddhism, because his PhD thesis was on Buddhism in Thailand. And as I said, he himself was a Buddhist. Venerable Sobhita and many militant Sinhala Buddhist organizations waged a huge campaign for the banning of this book by Professor Stanley Tambaya. So, during that phase of the 80s and early 90s, I wouldn't say that religious harmony was his main objective. But then people change, all of us change, and he mellowed and became a voice of moderation and liberalism in the last, certainly in the last decade of his life.
Many say that his shoes will be a difficult one to fill in. Do you believe this is true?
His sandals. It depends on what they're talking about. If they're talking about
in terms of politics and his role as a religious leader.
We've had a tradition of Buddhist prelates, Buddhist monks, playing this kind of role, going back to the 1940s. So we really do not know whether there would be some other monk who is also inspired by the role that Venerable Sobhita played. So it's difficult to say. But in a certain sense, I think it will not be possible to do so again, because Venerable Sobhita is most renowned for what he did in the last few years. And that was a strong civil society platform at a particular time. Now, in his last few months, Venerable Sobhita himself expressed views of dissent. He was unhappy with the way things were working out, and this is confirmed by Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasari, who was the main ideologue or the chief academic voice in that movement that Venerable Sobhita formed. So Nirmal Ranjit Devasari probably knows more than anybody else what the real thinking of Venerable Sobhita was in the last few months of his life. So already before he passed away, Venerable Sobhita noted and was saddened by the end of that project. So that time came and went, that project came and went. Therefore, I don't think it will be possible for anybody to fill his sandals, as it were, because that particular time has come and gone. And the project is on a sort of a parabolic downswing. You can see that with the open arguments between ministers, very bitter mudslinging and so on. I think Venerable Sobhita was quite saddened by the way things were going, and I don't think that role can be replicated because that time is over.
Dr. Jayatilak, you mentioned that Venerable Sobhita Thera's main aspirations was to abolish the executive presidency.
Yes.
Just to touch on that, at his final rites ceremony at Parliament grounds, President Sirisena in fact said that he will do everything in his efforts and power to fulfill the aspirations of Venerable Sobhita Thera by abolishing the executive presidency and changing the electoral system. What is your take on that?
Well, it all depends on the timing, and you really have to translate what he said, because there's speculation as to what President Sirisena meant. Did he mean that he would abolish the presidency now as part of the new constitution that is being planned and go home? Because if he does abolish the presidency, then Prime Minister Wickremesinghe becomes the leader of the country. Or did he mean that he would abolish the executive presidency and he himself would come into Parliament as the executive Prime Minister, in which case Prime Minister Wickremesinghe won't have a job. And what about the timing? Did President Sirisena mean that he would remain the executive president, albeit with fewer powers, as per the 19th Amendment, until the end of this first term? And then weigh his options, whether to retire or to come into Parliament to contest the elections. So, the statement was important, but it can be interpreted in several ways. It can be interpreted as a threat to the present UNP Prime Minister, who would otherwise be the leader if the executive presidency were abolished. It could be an indication to the SLFP, look, I'll be coming to Parliament and then we can change things. There'll be a new constellation of forces. There'll be a new configuration, it'll be a new government. Or it could be that, I'm going to do this and I'm going home.
Switching gears from Venerable Sobhita Thero's passing, this week we heard the tragic news of an attack in Paris where 132 people were killed. What is your comment on that?
Oh, well, we could talk all night about that. I was particularly saddened because I served in Paris as Sri Lanka's ambassador and also our permanent delegate to the UNESCO, which is based in Paris. And it was particularly shocking and saddening for me and my wife to see these scenes on television. It has had a tremendous impact on the world because France and the city of Paris holds such a place in the intellectual culture of the world as a whole. It has caused grief and sadness and shock, but it has done something more. It seems to have caused a change in the foreign policy and the attitude of the West, because France, until the attack, considered President Hafez al-Assad, Bashar Assad, I keep confusing the father and the son, the wrong generation, as the main enemy. Now
things have seemed to have deviated from him.
Yes, President Hollande, in his speech at the Versailles, speaking to the joint session of the Senate and the Parliament, said that while we do not think that President Assad can be part of the future of Syria in any transition, our enemy in Syria is Daesh. So in other words, it's not Assad anymore.
It's Islamic State.
And he went on to say that we must form a giant coalition against ISIS, or Daesh as it's called, and in pursuit of that ideal, he will be meeting President Obama and President Putin soon. Now earlier, the West didn't want to have anything to do with the Russian and Iranian intervention in Syria in support of President Assad and against ISIS. But now, you could see at the G20 summit in Turkey, President Obama and President Putin seated together in the bar with only their interpreters.
Much closer than you and I are talking right now.
Absolutely. With their interpreters, no officials, and the two of them leaning towards each other and talking.
And they've actually hinted that they want to work in coordination to defeat ISIS.
Absolutely, absolutely. So
do you think this has changed, like you said, changed the mindset of the West, in turn bringing Russia and US much closer than they ever were?
Much closer, much closer. There's already speculation of joint operations. And this is of fundamental importance because President Putin warned the West in his speech a few weeks ago at the UN General Assembly. This was in very late September, where speaking on the same day just after President Obama, President Putin put forward a different perspective. He told the West, he said, you will be targeted by terrorism and you have helped create this. He said, you have supported this so-called Arab Spring, and toppled governments which were holding down fundamentalist terrorism. You have invaded countries and destroyed states, such as Libya, such as Iraq earlier, and you were moving against the Syrian state. You have to decide whether you are with the state or with the terrorists, because it's the states that are fighting the terrorists. And he said, have you even now understood the blunders you have committed? So President Putin has now been vindicated, because he made it very clear. He even said, we need a broad international alliance of the sort that we had during World War II against Nazism, against fascism, where the Soviet Union at that time and the Western democracies formed the United Front. At that time, just a few weeks ago, nobody wanted to touch it with a barge pole. But now, it looks like that's about to happen. And that would be a major change in world affairs.
Now, there's another issue at hand, Dr. Jayatilaka. When the conflict in Syria started between the rebels and President Bashar al-Assad's regime, the United States of America, they essentially supported the rebels, they funded them, but they said that they want to create democracy. However, how can providing arms or funding the rebels for a particular faction to wage war against the government bring democracy to a country?
Well, exactly. There's now a leaked report of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. That report, actually not leaked, it came out as a result of a court proceeding. As you know, the election season has started in the United States. The primaries haven't started, but already within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party, there are rival candidates who are debating. And as part of a criticism of Hillary Clinton, some U.S. citizens filed under the Freedom of Information Act for U.S. intelligence reports, some intelligence reports to be declassified. And just last week, a DIA report, Defense Intelligence Agency report, was declassified. 2012 was the date of that. And the DIA predicted that U.S. policy was going to create something like ISIS, that it would help the terrorist movements. Because what is ISIS? The core of ISIS was Al-Qaeda in North Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Of course, the leader, Zarqawi, was killed by the US. But what was Al-Qaeda? As former President of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, said on television last week in Pakistan in a controversial interview, he said, Bin Laden was one of our heroes. Why was he Pakistan's heroes? Why was he one of our heroes? Because the Americans told us that we should adopt it. It's the Americans who came and got us all involved, got Pakistan involved, because they wanted to destabilize the Afghan communists who were in power after the revolution of 78, and they wanted to destabilize the Soviet Union. So the Americans came and introduced us to all these guys. They were the heroes of the Americans, Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. Then they were our heroes. So now we are being blamed, said Pervez Musharraf. So Al-Qaeda was part of the American, it came out of the American involvement in Afghanistan, supporting the Mujahideen against Russia at that time. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda turned on the United States. Now, ISIS is the result of two things. One, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, as it's called, Al-Qaeda in North Africa, that branch, which was hit by the Americans later, but reformed as ISIS. And then, the other stream that fed into ISIS were the Sunni insurgents
fighting the Assad regime.
And Iraq, after the Iraqi state was smashed by American intervention. And the Syrian state was put under siege. These are the Sunni tribes of Iraq and Syria, together with the former Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. That's ISIS. So, as the DIA report predicted in 2012, What we are doing now, they were critical, is going to lead to a strong Islamist terrorist movement. So it's Western policy from Afghanistan in the late 70s through to the invasion and occupation of Iraq, the assassination of Gaddafi, and their policy in Syria against the Syrian state that resulted in the terrorism in Paris. But of course, I mean, for Sri Lankans, there is an irony in this, because what happened in Paris was barbaric. 129, now it says 132 were killed. But we had several such things in our lifetime.
Exactly what I want to touch on, Dr. Jayatilaka. Why has this particular Paris attack itself been the focus of discussion, while on the same day there were twin bombings in Lebanon, and there were twin bombings in Beirut, there were attacks in Kenya. More than 150 people were killed in Kenya, by the way. But that has not received as much attention as this has got. Why? Is it because it is the West?
Well, there are two reasons, Shaheen. One is that in the imagination of the world, all of us, Paris plays a certain part in the same way that New York did. So we identify with these cities and their contributions more than we identify with other cities. That's the legitimate part of the reaction. But there's another part of the reaction, which is, if I may be very crude about it, racism. That is, if you're white, or if you're a white society.
I was going to use a much harsher word as humane, but okay.
Then, you know, if there's terrorism and your people are killed, then, you know, all those societies get shocked, and you can use words like, we are at war, we are going to eradicate this, we are going to be merciless. But if somebody else does it, then he becomes a war criminal. Take Gaddafi. The West framed Gaddafi. Gaddafi said exactly what François Hollande is saying now about the terrorists in Libya. He said, we will eradicate them mercilessly. That phrase was taken out of context, and it was said that he is going to cause a bloodbath in Benghazi. He said he's going to eradicate all the people of Benghazi. And then they bombed Libya, the West, and finally facilitated the brutal murder of Gaddafi. But when their own societies are attacked, then it's war, and they're going to defeat terrorism, they're going to eradicate terrorism, they're going to be merciless. That's fine. How come when we do it, it's a war crime, or it's an intention to commit a war crime, and they want a ceasefire? Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister at that time, as you know, accompanied David Miliband, the British foreign secretary, to try to prevent the government of Sri Lanka from finishing off the job. If we didn't finish off the LTTE, we would have still been like Paris, because we were. France has 60 million people, we have 20 million. So if you adjust for the population, we had many more such attacks for a longer time than any Western society has experienced. I'm not talking about the tigers attacking the army. I'm not saying that's good, but that's something else. I'm talking about civilian targets. Nayaru, Kokilai, Anuradhapura, over 100. Maradana, Peta, bombs. The Deivila commuter train. Nugegoda, the shop. Kabitigolava, Arantalava, Habarana, Katankudi, worshippers. But out there in the West, nobody cared. Not too much. And even now, they would never say that the Sri Lankans went through far worse. But as a society, we can be proud, Shaheen, because we did something that these powerful states are finding it very hard to do. We beat the terrorists. We did what they are now saying they want to do. Eradicate terrorism. And I think it's hypocritical for them to sit in judgment of us and want us to have foreign judges to judge our armed forces that saved us from the kind of terrorism that they are now trying to save their societies from. So those are the double standards. That's the hypocrisy that you see on the part of the dominant powers of the world, mainly the West. Even when the Russian plane was blown up over the Sinai,
exactly,
these Western societies didn't talk much about that. There was no mourning, no condemnation, not much anyway. You hardly heard about it. So, you have to belong to a Western society.
Particular class, if I may say.
Well, global class. I mean, the people who died were not rich. But you have to belong to the West. And then it's terrible, it's barbaric, it's an unspeakable barbarity. But if it happens here, it's not.
Hello and welcome back to the show. We're in discussion regarding the current affairs around the world with Dr. Dayanjaya Tilaka. Dr. Dayanjaya Tilaka, now moving spheres again. The current issue in Sri Lanka, now moving from Paris to Sri Lanka. The detention of a group of political prisoners at several prisons in Sri Lanka, and they're staging a hunger strike under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. What is your take on that?
Well, in the first place, are they political prisoners? I mean, what is a political prisoner? A political prisoner is somebody who is detained because of his or her political beliefs. Now, there are political prisoners in the world. We've also had political prisoners. But if you are detained because you've been convicted for an act of terrorist violence in which people died, then you're not a political prisoner. You're a convicted terrorist. So, in the first place, I don't think we should use this term political prisoner unless it can be shown that whoever it is in jail because of his or her politics. But if they are in jail because they murdered somebody, that's not a political prisoner. That's one confusion.
Yeah. Do you believe they should be released?
Well, if they're not political prisoners, they shouldn't be released. I mean, if they are political prisoners, then of course nobody should be in custody because of their political views. It's a democracy. But if in pursuit of their political views they committed criminal acts, especially criminal acts of terrible sort, then of course they should not be released. I mean, which society does it? Look at the United States. They have people in Guantanamo for 12 years without trial. I'm not saying it's a good thing.
But then Guantanamo Bay has come under scrutiny several times.
Yes, but they're not releasing people. They're not shutting it down because they want their society safe. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, if there is somebody who's been in custody because of his or her political views, they should be free. But if they're in custody because they've committed acts of violence, and that has been proven in a court of law, then they have to serve their sentence. Now, if there are people who are in custody for years, and they have not been produced before a court, if there is no legal procedure and they're just languishing in jail, it's inhuman to keep them in custody. Then those people should be released. But if they have been, if the legal proceedings have been instituted, if the legal proceedings are ongoing, then I don't see why they should be released, because there's a legal procedure. If, for instance, they think that there was something wrong with their convictions, then there's the process of appeal. As happens in many countries, people are released because their lawyers appeal and they show that there was something wrong with the original trial. Now, what you can't do is say, look, these guys were arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The Prevention of Terrorism Act is wrong, and therefore we are going to release them. The Prevention of Terrorism Act still exists. The Prevention of Terrorism Act was brought into being during the war. Those people are in detention because they committed violations of that Prevention of Terrorism Act during the war. There is nobody who has been detained under the PTA after the war. Now, if somebody is taken in now under the PTA, then of course you can make a case. You can say, look, this legislation was brought in during the war. There is no war anymore. This is not, you mustn't try this person under the PTA unless he was trying to plant a bomb. But that's not what this is about. These are all people who are detained under the PTA for acts committed during the war. And Sri Lanka released 11,600 tiger activists after rehabilitation because it was a very humane program. Even though you took up a gun and fought against the Sri Lankan army, that didn't mean that you were locked up. Those people were rehabilitated and released. The ones who are left behind are those who did not fall into that category. These are people, apart from a handful, I think about 40 who have not yet been
Dr.
brought
Jatali, there's
before
speculation that some of these detainees, some of these prisoners who have been detained, they do not have clear evidence to hold them. And if they do, even if they are guilty of a particular offense, some factions who are related to that crisis are saying that they've served a far more sentence than they originally should have in terms of their punishment. What is your take on that? And many also say that the PTA should be repealed or amended. Do you agree?
Well, then you have to repeal or amend the PTA. You can't release people.
Let's go to the first question, Dr. Jatirka, in terms of releasing them if they don't have evidence against them.
Well, of course, if they have been languishing in jail without any legal proceedings, then they should be released. But of the 217 that are being talked about, how many fall into that category, and why is it that no newspaper has carried the story? Why is it that the government has not issued a press release saying there are 217 in custody? Of them, there are X number who have been there for several years without evidence, and there's Y, these people have been convicted, and there's Z. Why don't we know the categories? Are people who planted bus bombs and killed school kids going to be released because somebody says that they've served enough time? Who? The TNA?
Now this brings us back to what you mentioned about Guantanamo Bay and the whole Paris situation.
Yeah.
Now you said that we defeated terrorism. There is also speculation and statements being expressed back and forth that yes, they were held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act and they were involved in such cases. But now, as you said, and as we all know, terrorism is no more in Sri Lanka. We've eradicated terrorism and it's been more than 6 years, I suppose. Again, my question to you, shouldn't they be rehabilitated into society and then released?
You can't rehabilitate people who killed innocent people. You can rehabilitate a guy who took up a rifle and fought the army. And we did that. 11,600. Which country immediately rehabilitated and released 11,600 fighters who belong to a separatist, guerrilla, terrorist movement? Nobody. We did it. But the ones we didn't release were the hardcore terrorists.
But
why should we release hardcore terrorists?
Has this been proven, Dr. Jayatila?
Well, that's what I'm saying. If it has been proven in a court of law, remove them from this discussion. They stay in jail. If it hasn't been proven, then they wouldn't have been convicted. Don't talk about releasing convicted terrorists. They stay in jail, they serve their sentence. You can release the guys who have been kept in detention without trial. Nobody should be kept in detention without trial, even though the West keeps them in Guantanamo without trial. The same, the US that moved a resolution preaching to us that we should release people. That's wrong, whoever does it. Whether the Americans do it or we do it, if you keep somebody in detention without trial, without initiating the legal procedure, without bringing them to trial, that is wrong. Those people should be let go. But nobody else. Not convicted hardcore terrorists. Because we had a very lenient policy. We released, as I said, normal combatants. Ex-LTT combatants were released, as no country does. Even the JVP, after the 1971 uprising, they stayed in jail from 1971 to 1976. We didn't release them. They were rehabilitated and released after 5 years. After the 1988 uprising of the JBP, they were released much later. But the Tiger combatants were released under a very humane policy, 11,600. And the ones we didn't release is not because we were adopting a harsh policy. If we were harsh, we wouldn't have released 11,600. The ones we didn't were the hardcore terrorists.
Do you think President Maithripala Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe should get involved in this? And if you say yes, how should they?
It's very simple. They should call for the files and they should say those who have been detained without trial can be released. But those against whom there is sufficient evidence for legal proceedings should not. And certainly those who have been convicted don't even ask us about it. They stay in custody and they serve their sentence. And you cannot even talk about releasing these guys when at the same time you're talking about having a special court with special prosecutors and foreign judges to try the armed forces that liberated us from terrorism. I mean, this is insane. Either you have one policy or you don't. I mean, this is crazy. You're going to you're summoning the former president before some court for not paying his bus fares while you're about to release guys, or you may have released guys who've blown up buses with school kids on them. You know, this is just crazy. I've never heard of this in any country in the world. And there's usually blowback. No society permits this kind of thing without consequence.
Again, my question to you is, in terms of the current situation, how the government or the court is handling this issue, do you agree how the situation is being handled right now?
No, because first the term political prisoners is being used while the Minister of Justice has said there are no political prisoners in Sri Lanka, which is true. Nobody is being detained because of their political views or their peaceful political practice. If they are in custody, it's because they are suspected of having committed violent offences, and violent offences which go beyond just taking a gun and fighting, because 11,600 such youngsters were sent home. So these are violent offences of a particularly nasty sort. Now, if people have not had legal proceedings instituted against them and they are just locked up, let them go, but only those.
But now the question is, why has it taken it so long?
Well, there is such a thing as law delays. Even the world superpower, as I said, they kept some guy and released an 80-year-old guy only a couple of, there are guys who've been there for 12 years. And that's the United States of America. We are not. So, this is the phrase known as laws delays. That's not a good thing. But it happens in the best of countries, the richest, where they can release people, they can go through. There are people who have been said to be innocent who are still locked up in Guantanamo. Now that's not a model, but it happens. So I would say that you can do a fast-track release of people who have not been brought to trial and who've just been locked up.
But there has been mentioned by certain government factions that it will take time to ascertain the proper situation.
So that's what I said, you do a fast track of those. But you cannot confuse this by bringing in people who have been convicted into the discussion at all. There shouldn't be a discussion about those who have been convicted under the PTA of serious acts of violence, which is why they are convicted. There cannot be a discussion about those against whom legal proceedings have been initiated. The only thing you can do is say speed it up.
Do you think it is essential or imperative that the President gets involved in this matter, or let the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Prison Reforms, Resettlement, the ministers to handle the situation and the Attorney General to handle the situation for now, see how they progress with the situation and then get involved, or get involved right now?
Well, he can get involved only in order to enunciate a clear policy. He can call for a report and he can say, look, my policy is such and such. We have to know what the policy is. People have to know who's being released back into society, because if they come and blow some other place up, who's going to be responsible? The President, the Prime Minister, Sumandran, Vigneshwaran, Sambandhan.
Let's not mention names, Dr. Jati.
No, these are the people who are campaigning.
Yeah, but
Sumandran is campaigning for this. Who is going to be responsible if hardcore terrorists go out and blow somebody else? Who is responsible for to the parents of children who died in Nugegoda when that blast, the Nolabit blast took place? They deliberately left a parcel so that it will blow up. What about the commuters on the Dahiwala train? What about the woman who was blinded because the central bank was blown up and she was working in the neighboring office? Who is responsible? Is there not going to be punishment for the people who did that?
Dr. Jatilka, just final word on this matter in particular. Leave aside the diplomacy, leave aside the fact that you're a political analyst. As a general citizen, you do not know that these people are guilty or not.
I know they're guilty if the courts have convicted them.
I'm not finishing my question. Just leave aside, like I'm saying, I'm trying to be...
No, but I do know that some of them are guilty.
Yeah, I know. Hang on. What I'm asking you is, you do not, for instance, like, figuratively, you do not know that these people are guilty or not. Leave aside the diplomacy.
I said I do.
Yeah, exactly.
If they're convicted, I know they're guilty.
No,
how else am I going to know whether they're guilty or not?
I'm asking you, do you think they should be released or not? Final words, yes or no?
If they have been convicted by a court, no. Unless they have served their sentence, in which case they will be allowed to go. But if they have been kept in custody without any legal proceedings, yes. Now that's not rocket science. If there are legal proceedings ongoing, no. You can expedite those legal proceedings. But you can't just release them if there is a legal proceeding against them. But if they've been there for 5 years without any legal proceeding, please release them in the next 24 hours.
Right, thank you very much. Dr. Jatilka, we'll switch gears again now from the political prisoners issue to...
They're not political prisoners.
Detention of prisoners under the Prevention
Alleged terrorists.
Yes. Let's move on to the avant-garde issue now. Just a couple of days ago, or rather a week ago, the former minister, or now former minister, Tilak Marapana, resigned from his portfolio due to this avant-garde controversy. What is your take on that?
He's a mature man. He made a speech in Parliament and then he had a press conference in which he answered a lot of questions. And he seemed to clear up much confusion. He said, I myself had thought that there were weapons, a large number of weapons which didn't have defense ministry clearance, and he said, look, these belong to foreign governments. Every one of those has end-user certificates. So there's a lot of stuff that he cleared up. And then Vijayadasa Rajapaksa, who has been a very strong critic of the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration, he is also a respected lawyer. And he says, look, I mean, the Attorney General's Department said that there's nothing illegal or they can't proceed on this, and I'm not going to move against anybody unless I'm convinced as a lawyer that there are grounds to move against them. So I'm listening to two credentialed lawyers here. Now I'm not a lawyer, but these are lawyers speaking about a matter of law. On the other hand, I have Dr. Rajitha Senaratna, whose profession is a dentist. I have Minister Champika Ranaweka, who is an engineer. These are all educated men, but they're not lawyers. Then I have Ranjan Ramanayaka, who's an actor, on the other side of this debate. Now, am I to take the view of the lawyers on a matter of law, or am I to take the view of non-lawyers on a matter of law? I think it's common sense that I would tend to go with the lawyers. So that's my take on that.
Again, we'll quickly move on to the current situation or current discussion, topic of discussion around the country in the political spectrum, this whole joint opposition scenario. What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's very interesting because...
An alleged joint opposition, if I might add.
Well, it looks joint to me because it's got about 10 political parties in it. So right now, they are more joint than the government, where you have ministers insulting each other on television. So it doesn't look so much like a unity government, but it does look like a joint opposition. They've got more than the official opposition. The official opposition is the TNA with 16 and the JVP with 5 or 6. The joint opposition or the new opposition has about 48 MPs. So that they've got the numbers. That's the reality. They exist. They've got the bodies. The second thing that strikes me is that these are, broadly speaking, pro-Mahinda Rajapaksa people. Now, they don't have any patronage. Mahinda Rajapaksa is out of power. He's not even the leader of the opposition. In this country, unlike most countries, you manage to have people loyal to you only if you have something to give them, and to give them something you have to be either minister or better still a prime minister, best of all a president. At least you have to be the leader of the opposition. But this grouping, a fairly large one, is in existence without a patron, without somebody who can give them anything. They are together despite disciplinary strictures from the General Secretary of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. Now that tells me that rightly or wrongly these are people who believe in something. They're not there for the posts or the perks.
Now if you look at the composition of the party, or I beg your pardon, of the parliament, we do have the ruling party obviously, and then which is of course made of a coalition government, and then we have the opposition, which is the TNA, the JVP and so on and so forth. So is it more factually or practically right that another faction called the joint opposition be made separately?
Well, if there are 48 guys and the supposed official opposition has 16, then obviously they have the numbers. That's the reality. That's the truth. How can somebody with 16 claim to be the leadership of the opposition when there are 48 guys who say we are the opposition? Doesn't make sense to me.
What is the motive behind this joint opposition?
Well, they say that they were elected to be the opposition. That's their mandate. People voted for them in order to make Mahinda Rajapaksa the Prime Minister. That didn't work. But people voted for them to oppose the UNP. And then on the morning after, without an SLFP party convention, a limited deliberative body, the Executive Committee or the Central Committee of the SLFP, which was stuffed with people who the voters had rejected at the election, decided that they will go into a national government. Now these 48 guys or 50 guys or whatever, they say, that's not what our people voted for, and we are not going to betray our voters. So we don't want to go sit with the UNP and be part of the government because we don't agree with what the UNP is doing. The UNP has agreed to the Geneva Resolution, which sells out national sovereignty and is going to have special courts to try the armed forces which liberated us from terrorism. We don't want to be part of a government with those guys. We are the opposition and we are bigger than the TNA. There you are. Now, it's possible that the government, that is the SLFP, may penalize these people. But what will happen as a result? At the next election, they will take that many SLFP voters away with them. So, one doesn't know the legal position, whether they can be deprived of their seats in parliament. They'll probably fight it in courts. And if somebody were to deprive them of their seats in parliament, then what's going to happen to the rest of the SLFP? The SLFP will split and the UNP will be predominant. Already there are strange sounds because Mr. Nimal Siripala de Silva, the minister, who is very much with President Sirisena, has given an interview to, actually spoken at some public rally in Al, and there's a report in the media. And he says, maybe people made a mistake on January 8th, they are regretting having made a mistake on January 8th. Now, he's a cabinet minister. So there's something happening in the SLFP, there's something happening at the grassroots. The joint opposition is reflecting it right now, but it's also happening within the SLFP in government. So it's obvious that some people should want to sit in opposition because there is a strong undercurrent at the level of the voters. Otherwise, Nimal Siripala de Silva wouldn't be saying what he said.
Before we wrap up, Dr. Jayatilaka, we'll go way back to our discussion about the Paris attacks. There is a lot of speculation regarding ISIS. They have been called an Islamic faction. What is your take on that?
Well, I'm reminded of what...
Quite briefly, Doctor.
Quite briefly, what Mahinda Rajapaksa told US Assistant Secretary of State Richard Boucher in May 2007 when I was in the room. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Boucher, what can I do if our terrorists are not Islamic? Now, the point that he was trying to make, which is also the point that Vladimir Putin made at the UNGA a few weeks ago is, it doesn't matter. If you engage in terrorism, it doesn't matter what you say motivates you. You are a terrorist. You can be a Tamil tiger, you can claim to be basing yourself on the Quran, it's irrelevant. If you are deliberately killing innocent people, unarmed people, then you are a terrorist. So, whether these people, of course, they claim to be Islamic, and you have to draw a distinction between Islamic and Islamist. But then they are killing Islamic people. In Beirut, they killed 43 people in an Islamic community center. So, it really doesn't matter. I think it's a misleading discussion. There are those who say, look, these guys are Islamic and these Islamic guys, they want to impose their way of life, they're crazy and so on. It really doesn't matter. If you're blown up by a bomb planted by a terrorist, what is important is that he or she or that movement is terrorist, and not what they claim to represent and believe in.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Jayatilaka, for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have Dr. Jayatilaka, always an interesting man to speak with. Till next time, I'm Shanj Rampati, Vantage Point. Good night.